The federal government's climate policy was dealt another blow yesterday. The federal court quashed the cabinet order which listed plastic manufactured items as toxic. The ruling said the classification was simply too broad. Meantime, the Liberals continue to face pressure to carve up their marquee carbon tax after giving a carve-out on home heating oil. There's also a Conservative private member's bill calling for an exemption to be made on fuel used by most farmers, and a lot of talk about what with Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault, especially when it comes around to the fact that in the Supreme Court, C-69 was struck down and because Alberta had challenged it. These are all things that the minister continues to deal with and continues to say that there will be no more carve-outs, and the Prime Minister has said that on a number of occasions, and Minister Steven Guilbeault continues to reiterate that. I believe that we may have the minister. We're waiting for... Okay, we don't have the minister just yet. We're going to go right to these clips from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre.
We are a government that has always exercised fiscal restraint.
The fall economic update is coming. Justin Trudeau must reverse the inflationary policies that have driven people out of their homes, driven interest rates up, and caused mass despair and misery.
And those are things that really have to be balanced by this government. Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault joins us right now from Montreal.
Right, sir,
Minister, thank you so much for making the time. I wanted to start with you with that federal court ruling yesterday. Your government is considering an appeal. When will you make that decision?
Most likely in the coming days. I would imagine by the beginning of next week we will have made a decision on that. But yes, we are strongly considering appealing the decision.
Now, the judge ruled that your government was overreaching when it tried to say everything that's plastic is toxic. Do you have evidence or a legal opinion otherwise? And why wasn't it enough to convince that judge?
There's overwhelming scientific evidence of the impacts of plastics on our health. There are studies right now done around the world where we're finding microplastic beads in our body, even in our brain. It is affecting fetus. It is affecting kids, our kids, and their growth process. It's impacting the environment and species all around the world. We've all seen those images of birds, fish, turtles caught in single-use plastic in our oceans. So there is, in fact, overwhelming scientific evidence, and we feel that on legal ground we're very solid. We respectfully disagree with the opinion of the judge yesterday, which is why, as I said earlier, we will likely appeal that decision.
So this ruling is the second time that your government has been told that you've gone too far by the courts. What's the point of legislation and policy that can't meet that basic legal test?
I would beg to differ. In fact, our pricing pollution system was challenged in the courts, and the Supreme Court ruled in our favor just 2 years ago. And on the impact assessment, I know a lot of people are talking about the fact that the court said that some elements of the acts were unconstitutional, but they also ruled that some of the elements are constitutional. So we're having to make some changes, some adjustments, and it's normal. I mean, we don't get it right every time we do legislation in the first time governments, and that's true on environmental issue. It's true on a number of different issues for our government and for many other governments. I think there's nothing wrong with course correcting when you're told you need to do things differently, and on impact assessment we will do that. And on plastic pollution, I mean, the reality is that beyond the ruling of yesterday, Canadians have already moved on, and the vast majority of companies have already moved on. I could talk about Labatt, for example, which will have eliminated by the end of this year, 6 months before the regulation was asking them to do so, the plastic rings for beer cans. I believe their last plant that they're retrofitting in Newfoundland will have phased out plastic rings by the end of the year. They've done it for all of their other plants. So, I mean, Canadians and most companies are already moving on and away from single-use plastics.
I take your point about course corrections, but your government can't move on with this legislation because it's now been struck down by the court. So is it responsible government, or isn't it responsible government, to make sure that what you're doing, that it'll impact Canadians and that it's actually legal to do so?
Well, of course, which is why we will likely appeal the decision, because both from a scientific point of view and from a legal point of view, we disagree with the ruling yesterday. And you may recall, if you remember, on the pricing pollution, we lost in lower courts, and in the end, the Supreme Court ruled in our favor. As you know, I mean, giving an individual judge to rule on an issue, it can go in different ways. But the reality, and in fact, the act that we're using, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, has been used in Canada for decades to help protect the health and environment of Canadians. It's not a new piece of legislation. It's actually 40 years old. It's been used many times. The judge took issue with some of the elements we did this time. We respectfully, again, disagree with that judge, which is why we will likely appeal.
Minister, I want to ask you about the carbon tax cutouts. The Prime Minister has said that there will be no more carve-outs, but there weren't supposed to be any to begin with. There is a private member's bill on a carve-out for fuel for farmers. If that happens, is that your red line? Will you resign as minister if there is a carve-out for that type of fuel?
As you rightly pointed out, the Prime Minister has said on a number of occasions that there would be no more carve-outs.
Okay, but if there are more, then what?
So I take my marching orders from the Prime Minister of Canada. I serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister of Canada. He's the one who nominated to cabinet, and I have my instructions I take my instructions from him. And the Prime Minister, as you pointed out, has said on a number of occasions that there would be no more exemption to carbon pricing in Canada.
So let's say tomorrow he says your marching orders are another carve-out. How would that make you feel?
You're asking a very hypothetical question, which has no foundation, because he has said.
Well, there's a private member's bill on the table, Minister. With respect, there's a private member's bill there, and we all were in a world at one point in time where there were going to be zero carve-outs, and now we have one. So I don't think it's that hypothetical.
There are tons of private members' bill that are debated in the House of Commons and in the Senate all the time. The bill you're referring to hasn't been adopted by the Senate yet. We will see what Senate the decision comes to in the coming weeks, most likely. But obviously, the Senate is independent from the House of Commons. And in fact, the Liberals, the Liberal government doesn't have Liberal senators, as opposed to the Conservatives, who still have Conservative senators in the Senate. So we don't dictate how senators should debate these things. We don't tell them how to vote, what position to take, and we will see what the Senate decide. But the Senate hasn't yet decided on this.
I wanted to ask you, you spent the bulk of your life as an environmentalist criticizing politicians who didn't do enough. Now environmentalists are saying you're allowing your government to not do enough. How do you respond to them?
Do you have a specific example? Because I could list a number of environmental organizations that have saluted the work we've done, whether it's to fight plastic pollution. No later than yesterday, organizations like Environmental Defense were saying how essential the work we're doing on plastic pollution is. Organizations like
I take your point on plastic pollution, but I don't know any one of those organizations that was happy with the carbon carve-out for home heating oil.
They have saluted our work on pricing pollution, on fighting climate change, on eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. They've spoken about the leadership. A spokesperson for Greenpeace in a recent interview said that he was the best environment minister that he's ever seen in Canada. So I think that environmentalists will continue to criticize us when they think we're not doing enough, but I think they are also on the record, many of them, many individuals and organizations, saluting the work our government has done, whether it's climate, whether it's fighting plastic pollution, whether it's the historic agreement we were able to negotiate last year at COP15 in Montreal to protect nature and biodiversity. I think that people are noticing how much work we're doing to try and change the way we're doing things in Canada when it comes to fighting for a better environment for our kids and grandkids.
Minister, last question for you. At what point do you decide that this government's priorities on the environment are no longer aligned with yours?
Listen, being environment minister is a dream job for me. I'm not going anywhere. I have, as you rightly pointed out, I have spent most of my entire adult life working on environmental issues and working to improve the state of the environment and health for Canadians. And I intend to continue doing that as long as Canadians will let me do it, or the Prime Minister, obviously.
So even if there's another carbon tax carve-out, you'll stay on as minister?
As I've said, and as the Prime Minister has said, there will be no more carve-outs to our pricing pollution system in Canada.
Okay, Minister, we're all out of time, but we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.